as we approach Thanksgiving, this whole collectivism thing, once tried, failed miserably. This country really began on the carcass of a failed socialist experiment. And I know it's been discussed before, but I think especially for the people who've never heard it, it's important to revisit this history because every year, what do you hear? The pilgrims were so mean. They were just people who wanted to leave and be able to worship. They were devoutly religious people. And when they came over on the Mayflower, which was when I went and actually read the proportions of this ship, I was actually kind of shocked. Like it's not the ship that I would think that you would take crossing the Atlantic, but whatever. I mean, they weren't rich people. They actually had sponsors. They had, Dutch sponsors. They had sponsors from Holland. They had business people, merchants that worked with them to sponsor their journey. And then the point of it was that it was collectivism. Everybody was going to own everything. Everybody was going to put in the work, and then everyone took an equal share. That was how their society was established. The business people through whom they got these sponsorships to come over here, they had established like basically one bank account for them all. And so they came over here, and everybody knows the Mayflower Compact and William Bradford and how every one of these 40 pilgrims on board, every one of these 40 pilgrims, they were all going to be equal regardless of their religion, regardless of what they believed, etc. And they nearly died. I mean, his wife died. They all starved to death practically. It was heinous. I mean, it was heinous, horrific conditions for which they tried to prepare themselves for, but ultimately, when it comes to facing nature raw in such a way, nature typically prevails, and it did over many of them. And they weren't successful. They weren't successful at all when they first started. This was the Bernie Sanders Biden dream. How they got started. I mean, they had common ownership. It didn't matter how much you worked because you were going to take home everything. You were going to take home your share regardless of how much you put in. There was a thing Bradford had written, and he said, quote, for the young men, talking about the collective work, for the young men that were able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without recompense. The strong or men of parts had no more division of food, clothes, etc., than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labor and food and clothes, etc., with the meaner and younger sort, thought it some indignant and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men as dressing their meat, washing their clothes, etc., they deemed it a kind of slavery, neither could husbands brook it. There was resentment. Men did not want to go and get food for other men's wives, and women were already busy taking care of their own. Hell, they didn't want to have to take care of another man, another woman's husband. It created resentment. If you're toiling away in the field, what incentive do you have to work harder if you were going to take home the same as the guy who was doing nothing regardless? That's the thing. Collectivism created a safety net for the people who had the ability and really the everything that they could need to work. They just didn't want to. And it created a lot of resentment. And William Bradford saw all of this, and he saw how dangerous it was. He saw that they were literally going to just complete destruction. I mean, they barely survived into spring. I mean, he lost his own wife. They barely survived. They nearly all starved to death going into spring. It was not enduring. It was just scraping by a very, very harsh winter. I don't know that the current generations now could deal with it. There's so many amongst us. I mean, my gosh, they freak out if they run out of the peppermint syrup at Starbucks. I mean, have you seen people like in fast food places get mad if their order's wrong? Can you imagine these people lasting in these conditions to create this new world? And so they're going into spring and they're realizing, as William Bradford wrote about, the collective farming thing, that was a disaster. He wrote in his diary that, quote, our food stores were used up. People grew weak and thin. Some swelled with hunger. So they began to think how they might not still thus languish in misery. He said that his answer was to divide the commune in parcels and assign each pilgrim family its own property. Because they were struggling so badly, Bradford realized the only way to do this, we're going to throw everything out of the window. Everything that we had determined before we came to this new world, everything that we had determined when we were on the Mayflower about collectivism, because this was a commune. It was a hippie commune. The first established living quarters here in the United States was a hippie commune that failed, and almost everybody died as a result. And so William Bradford thought, okay, this is not going to work. We've got to do something. And he realized that if they went through another harsh season like the one they just barely survived through, he realized the whole colony was gone. So he and the elders, they got together and they thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to introduce privatization, private property, and everyone gets the same parcel, the same size parcel, and they can, as he wrote, set corn every man for his own particular, assigned every family a parcel of land, and made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. When he did it this way, and families realized that they could get more for what they put into it, the privatization and the opportunity incentivized industriousness. So they worked harder and they worked smarter. And Bradford noted, he said, quote, this had a very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so much so, he said that the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability. And he said that the men worked harder, and that they worked so hard, and that they brought such a harvest that they actually had extra that they could use to trade. And he said that it became so successful that they went on from parcels to private farms. And then every family had surpluses that they could freely exchange with their neighbors for mutual benefit and improvement. The first Thanksgiving was born of that. The first Thanksgiving was born of a very radical idea that came about because they saw that socialism, that collectivism was not going to work, that it fostered resentment and an unwillingness to put in the time because you were not going to get rewarded for how hard you worked. Hard work wasn't a virtue. Caring about your task wasn't a virtue. It allowed everyone to skate by with the same level of mediocrity. And it nearly wiped out the entire first colony. And so when they finally realized, and nobody else was doing this, they didn't know what to call it. They didn't call it capitalism. They had no idea what it was. They just knew it hadn't been tried before. And it was so successful, they had surpluses. They traded with each other. If one family didn't have this, they had this. They had something they wanted, they traded. They went on from their single parcels to entire private farms. And when they got together, they came about, and there was only one witness to this. In my notes, all we know about the first Thanksgiving extended to one man named Edward Winslow. An eyewitness, he had one paragraph, and this is from the Smithsonian, describing one Indian, the Massasoit, showing up with 90 men. They killed 5 deer to cook with what the English were preparing, and then they feasted for 3 days. And they were creating this feast, the pilgrims, because they wanted to give thanks to God for getting them through a season and preparing them well for the next. Thanksgiving was born of gratefulness to be able to not just mess up, but given the opportunity to rectify an error, make good a mistake, work harder, and have such a surplus that it allowed you to care for your neighbor willingly, not by force, not by contract, not by understanding, but out of sheer, genuine love in the heart. They wanted to care for each other because they had the ability to do so. They were incentivized to work harder. It made them grow. It edified their spirit. That is where the first Thanksgiving came from. And they were able to trade and develop relations with indigenous nations. And they feasted, as Edward Winslow said, for 3 days. One paragraph is all the description there was of it. And they got through that first hard season, and then they went through the next season much more prepared, much more stocked, and with wisdom and bigger hearts. That's what Thanksgiving is. It's born on the back of one of a really bad mistake, but they were given the opportunity to right it. And they did. And it also showcases, even if the intention is pure of heart, the result fosters an evil. And it creates a resentment. People have to be able to enjoy the fruits of their own labor. That is biblical. It's even discussed in the New Testament that you are given things by God for your enjoyment. And yes, you're called to be a good steward of your fellow man. And this is one of the things that the Pilgrims, who were incredibly devout, recognized. And it is exactly what they did after they got through that first season. This is what Thanksgiving is about. This is why we have Thanksgiving. This is what they don't teach in schools, because it highlights the failure of a system that has been tried and has collapsed in every single country, in every single nation, any point in history, any time it's ever been implemented, it has failed. Collectivism denies individual will, and even God grants you that. That's the story of the first Thanksgiving in America.